2 years had passed since Emily Peterson vanished without a trace, and the weight of those 730 days pressed down on Laura Peterson's shoulders like a physical burden she could never set down. The small Texas town of Cedar Ridge, once a place where everyone knew everyone and children played safely in tree-lined streets until dusk, had become a prison of memories and whispered conversations that died the moment she entered a room. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. Laura's life had fractured into a series of mechanical routines punctuated by moments of desperate searching. As a high school English teacher, she had always found solace in the predictable rhythm of lesson plans and grading papers. But now even Shakespeare's sonnets felt hollow against the thunderous absence of her daughter's laughter, echoing through their two-story colonial home. The hallways that once buzzed with Emily's teenage energy now stretched endlessly, each creaking floorboard a reminder of footsteps that would never again bound up the stairs two at a time. Her husband, Mark Peterson, had retreated into a fortress of pragmatism that felt impenetrable. Once the town's most optimistic firefighter, the man who had saved countless lives from burning buildings and rescued cats from towering oaks, now approached their tragedy with the cold logic of someone who had seen too much loss. His broad shoulders, which had once carried Emily on piggyback rides around their backyard, now seemed permanently hunched under the weight of statistical probability and police reports that grew thicker, but never more hopeful. Mark's days began before dawn with rigorous physical training, as if he could somehow outrun the grief that stalked their household, and ended with him falling asleep in his recliner, the television casting blue shadows across his weathered face. While Mark had slowly accepted what the police gently suggested after 18 months of fruitless investigation, Laura's faith had become her lifeline and her obsession. She threw herself into the administrative duties of Cedar Ridge Community Church with a fervor that both impressed and worried Pastor William. Every Sunday morning found her arriving 2 hours early to arrange flowers, organize bulletins, and ensure that every hymnal was perfectly aligned in its wooden rack. The familiar ritual of preparing communion wine and breaking bread into precise portions gave her hands something to do, while her mind wandered through endless scenarios of Emily's whereabouts. She volunteered for every church committee, organized bake sales with military precision, and spent countless hours in the church basement sorting donated clothes, always secretly hoping that somehow, through her service to others, God would return her daughter to her. Their marriage had become a careful dance around the elephant in the room. Mark would return from his shifts at the fire station, his uniform smelling of smoke and disinfectant, and find Laura hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by printed photographs, police reports, and missing person flyers that had long since faded from storefront windows around town. The kitchen that had once been the heart of their home, where Emily had done her homework while Laura cooked dinner and Mark told stories about his day, now felt like a war room where two soldiers fought different battles for the same lost cause. The turning point arrived on a particularly suffocating Tuesday night in late September. The Texas heat had finally broken, but the oppressive humidity seemed to seep through the walls of their home like a living thing. Laura had been lying in bed for 3 hours, listening to Mark's steady breathing beside her, counting the familiar sounds of their neighborhood settling into sleep. Mrs. Henderson's ancient air conditioning unit wheezed and clicked from next door. A dog barked twice in the distance before falling silent. The grandfather clock in their hallway chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. Unable to bear the weight of her restless thoughts any longer, Laura slipped from under the covers, her bare feet finding the cool hardwood floor. She padded silently through the darkened house, past Emily's bedroom where the door remained exactly as it had been 2 years ago, past the living room where Mark's work boots sat precisely aligned by the front door, and into the kitchen where moonlight filtered through gauze curtains, casting ethereal patterns across the linoleum floor. Laura settled into the wooden chair that had become her unofficial command post, its worn cushion molded to the shape of her sleepless vigils. Her laptop, permanently plugged in and warm to the touch from constant use, hummed to life with a soft blue glow that illuminated her face in the darkness. The screen displayed dozens of bookmarked pages, missing children databases, private investigator forums, social media groups for parents of vanished children, and always, the Google Maps street view of Oakwood Elementary School. Her fingers, trembling slightly from exhaustion and caffeine withdrawal, navigated to the familiar coordinates with muscle memory born of countless repetitions. The street view loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, revealing the cheerful yellow brick facade of Emily's school, the chain-link playground where she had spent countless recess periods, and the crosswalk where Laura had dropped her off for the last time on that ordinary Wednesday morning that had shattered their world. Laura's eyes traced every detail of the scene she had memorized with photographic precision. The stop sign with its barely visible graffiti tag in the lower right corner, the oak tree whose branches had grown noticeably fuller in the 2 years since the images were captured, the small crack in the sidewalk that formed an almost perfect question mark, as if the earth itself was asking where Emily had gone. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, her methodical examination of the familiar scene led her away from the main street, down a narrow alley she had explored dozens of times before, but never with such focused intensity. Her cursor moved with deliberate slowness, turning the virtual camera degree by degree, searching shadows and doorways for any detail she might have previously overlooked. The alley was lined with dumpsters and the rear entrances of small businesses. Tony's Pizza, where Emily had begged for extra cheese on countless Friday nights. Miller's Hardware, where Mark bought supplies for his endless home improvement projects. And the small medical clinic, where Dr. Patterson had treated Emily's broken wrist from her ill-fated skateboarding adventure the previous summer. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she noticed something that made her heart hammer against her ribcage with sudden, violent force. There, barely visible in the grainy pixelation of the Google Street View camera, stood 2 figures near the corner where the alley met Elm Street. The image quality was poor, the kind of digital blur that could be interpreted a dozen different ways, but Laura's maternal instincts screamed recognition. The smaller figure appeared to be a teenager, roughly Emily's height and build, with shoulder-length brown hair that caught the afternoon sunlight in a way that was achingly familiar. But it was the clothing that made Laura's hands shake so violently she nearly knocked over her cold coffee mug. The figure was wearing what appeared to be a burgundy hooded sweatshirt with distinctive white ribbing around the cuffs and waistband. Laura's vision blurred as memories flooded back with devastating clarity. Emily's 14th birthday, just 3 months before she disappeared. Laura had spent weeks secretly working on a surprise gift, staying up late in the basement craft room, carefully selecting the softest yarn in Emily's favorite color. She had taught herself new stitching techniques from YouTube videos, determined to create something unique and special for her daughter, who had recently declared store-bought clothes boring and impersonal. The sweatshirt had been Laura's masterpiece, a labor of love that incorporated Emily's initials subtly woven into the pattern of the left sleeve, along with a small heart on the inside collar that only Emily would know was there. When Emily had opened the gift, her face had lit up with genuine delight, and she had worn the sweatshirt constantly for weeks, declaring it the most comfortable thing she had ever owned. Emily had been wearing that exact sweatshirt the morning she disappeared. The confrontation that followed Laura's discovery erupted at dawn, when the Texas sun began filtering through their bedroom blinds in harsh golden strips that seemed to illuminate every crack in their fractured marriage. Mark had awakened to find Laura's side of the bed cold and empty, the sheets twisted into a testament of her restless night. He discovered her in the kitchen, still hunched over her laptop, her eyes red-rimmed from staring at the screen, and her coffee cup long since emptied and refilled multiple times. When Laura showed him the pixelated image, pointing with trembling fingers at the blurred figures in the alley, Mark's reaction was immediate and devastating. His weathered hands gripped the laptop screen, tilting it toward the window light as if better illumination could somehow transform the grainy digital artifacts into concrete evidence. His jaw tightened in the way that had become familiar over the past 2 years, a muscle memory of disappointment that Laura had learned to recognize as the precursor to another crushing reality check. Mark's eyes, once warm brown pools that had sparkled with laughter during their courtship, now held the flat pragmatism of a first responder who had seen too many false hopes crumble into dust. He studied the image with the methodical precision he brought to fire investigations, analyzing burn patterns and structural damage, searching for truth in chaos. But where Laura saw her daughter's distinctive silhouette and the unmistakable burgundy sweatshirt she had lovingly crafted, Mark saw only a collection of ambiguous pixels that could be interpreted as anything by a desperate mind. The silence between them stretched like a chasm, filled with all the arguments they had already fought and all the disappointments they had already endured. Laura watched her husband's face, memorizing the exact moment when skepticism hardened into something approaching pity. She saw him mentally cataloging this moment alongside the dozens of other leads they had pursued. The woman in the grocery store who swore she had seen Emily, the phone call from someone claiming to have information that led nowhere, the psychic who had taken $200 to tell them Emily was near water. But this was different, and Laura felt it in her bones with the same certainty that had once told her when Emily was running a fever or hiding something from her parents. This image, however blurred and ambiguous, contained something that spoke to the part of her that had carried Emily for 9 months, that had known her daughter's footsteps on hardwood floors and her silhouette in doorways. The maternal instinct that had been screaming for 2 years had found its voice in these few pixels arranged on a screen. The tension in their kitchen became almost physical, pressing against the walls like humidity before a storm. Mark's shoulders sagged with the weight of watching his wife disappear deeper into what he feared was delusion, born of unbearable grief. He recognized the dangerous light in her eyes, the same fervor that had driven her to reorganize Emily's room every few months, as if the perfect arrangement of teenage belongings could somehow summon their daughter home. Laura's obsession with maintaining Emily's space exactly as she had left it had become another source of friction between them. Mark wanted to pack away the constant reminders of their loss, while Laura treated each item as a sacred relic. Laura, meanwhile, felt the familiar sting of her husband's doubt, like salt in an open wound. She watched him close the laptop with deliberate gentleness, the kind of careful movement one uses around the mentally fragile, and something hardened inside her chest. For 2 years, she had endured his patient skepticism, his gentle suggestions that perhaps they should consider grief counseling, his increasingly frequent mentions of moving forward and accepting what had happened to Emily. Each suggestion felt like a betrayal, as if Mark was asking her to attend their daughter's funeral while Emily was still somewhere in the world, waiting to be found. The argument that followed was conducted in the careful, measured tones of 2 people who had learned to fight quietly to avoid disturbing the ghost of their daughter that still lived in every room of their house. Mark's voice carried the practiced patience of someone explaining reality to a child, while Laura's responses crackled with the desperate energy of a mother who refused to let go of hope, no matter how irrational it appeared to others. Mark enumerated the logical objections with the systematic thoroughness of a fire safety inspection. The image was taken over a year ago, according to the Google Maps timestamp. Even if it was Emily, which he doubted, she could be anywhere by now. They had no resources for cross-country travel, no connections in San Diego, no plan beyond chasing shadows across the continent. His fire department salary and her teacher's income had already been stretched thin by 2 years of private investigators, reward money, and countless trips to follow false leads that had led nowhere but deeper into debt and despair. But Laura's resolve had crystallized into something unbreakable during that sleepless night. She spoke of faith and intuition, of signs that others might dismiss, but that she recognized as divine guidance. Her involvement with Cedar Ridge Community Church had deepened her belief that God would not abandon Emily or the family that loved her. She had prayed every night for 2 years, asking for a sign, a direction, anything that would lead them to their daughter. This image, blurred though it might be, felt like an answer to those prayers. The preparation for their journey became another battlefield where their different approaches to hope and pragmatism clashed repeatedly. Mark insisted on contacting the San Diego Police Department first, providing them with copies of the image and Emily's missing person information. He spent hours on the phone with Detective Rodriguez, a weary-sounding officer who had clearly fielded thousands of similar calls from desperate parents chasing digital phantoms. The detective's promise to look into the matter was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed complete skepticism. Laura, meanwhile, threw herself into research with the manic energy that had sustained her through 2 years of searching. She studied San Diego's geography like a military strategist, memorizing street names and neighborhood demographics, researching homeless shelters and teen outreach programs, printing maps and marking potential locations where a missing girl might surface. Her dining room table became a command center covered with highlighted printouts, sticky notes color-coded by priority, and a growing collection of phone numbers for every organization in San Diego that worked with missing children. The financial strain of the trip required painful sacrifices that highlighted how thoroughly Emily's disappearance had devastated every aspect of their lives. Mark cashed in part of his retirement fund, while Laura sold her grandmother's antique jewelry, pieces she had planned to pass down to Emily someday. They booked the cheapest possible flight, a red-eye departure that would leave them exhausted but save crucial dollars. Laura packed with the desperate efficiency of someone who might not return home for weeks or months, including multiple copies of Emily's photograph, missing person flyers, and the original pattern for the burgundy sweatshirt, as if having the knitting instructions might somehow serve as proof. The night before their departure, their house felt suspended in a strange limbo between hope and dread. Mark methodically checked and rechecked their travel documents, his movements sharp with barely controlled anxiety. He had taken an unpaid leave of absence from the fire department, something that would have been unthinkable before Emily's disappearance, when his job had been his primary source of identity and purpose. Now, watching his wife disappear into another obsession, he felt willing to risk everything on the slim chance that this time might be different. Laura spent her final evening at home in Emily's room, sitting on the perfectly made bed surrounded by the artifacts of her daughter's abbreviated adolescence. Emily's bookshelf still held the same arrangement of young adult novels and school textbooks, while her dresser displayed the same collection of cheap jewelry and lip glosses that had seemed so important to a 14-year-old girl. The burgundy sweatshirt's absence from the closet felt like a wound, its empty hanger a daily reminder of that last ordinary morning when Laura had watched Emily grab her backpack and head out into a world that had swallowed her without a trace. Their departure was orchestrated in the pre-dawn darkness, with Mark loading their single shared suitcase into his pickup truck, while Laura stood in their front yard, memorizing the silhouette of their house against the lightening sky. She wondered if they would return as the same people who were leaving, or if San Diego would transform them in ways she could not yet imagine. The GPS estimated 32 hours of driving time, not including stops, meals, or the inevitable delays that came with crossing state lines on rural highways. The journey itself became a meditation on the geography of hope and despair. Mile after mile of Texas countryside gave way to the alien landscapes of New Mexico and Arizona, each state border marking another degree of separation from everything familiar and safe. Laura navigated while Mark drove, her eyes constantly scanning the endless stream of truck stops and small towns, wondering if Emily might be somewhere in this vast expanse of America, living a life that bore no resemblance to the one she had been born into. Every mile that passed beneath their tires carried them further from the life they had built in Cedar Ridge, and closer to a truth that neither of them was prepared to face. The possibility that Emily was alive somewhere in San Diego felt simultaneously miraculous and terrifying. If she was there, what had happened to her during these 2 missing years? What kind of person had she become? Would she even remember the parents who had never stopped searching for her? But equally devastating was the possibility that they would find nothing, that this trip would end like all the others, with empty hands and hearts somehow broken even further than they had been before. San Diego greeted them with a marine layer that clung to the coastal city like a gray blanket, transforming the morning sunlight into a diffused glow that made everything appear slightly unreal. After 32 hours of relentless driving through desert landscapes that had gradually given way to palm trees and ocean breezes, Laura and Mark found themselves in a world that felt foreign to their Texas sensibilities. The air carried unfamiliar scents of salt water, blooming jacaranda, and something indefinably urban that spoke of millions of lives intersecting in ways that small-town Cedar Ridge could never imagine. Their budget motel room on the outskirts of the city reflected the harsh financial realities of their quest. The carpet bore stains that spoke of countless previous occupants, while the thin walls transmitted every sound from neighboring rooms with uncomfortable clarity. Mark collapsed onto the bed nearest the window, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion that had accumulated over miles of highway hypnosis. But Laura remained wired with nervous energy that made sleep impossible. She spread her research materials across the small table by the window, creating a familiar command center that helped anchor her in this strange new environment. The area captured in the Google Maps image proved to be part of San Diego's East Village, a neighborhood in transition where gentrification battles with entrenched poverty created a complex urban ecosystem. Laura navigated these streets with the intensity of an archaeologist examining ancient ruins, her eyes scanning every doorway, every alley, every face that passed by. The specific corner where the blurred figures had been captured sat at the intersection of ordinary urban life. A convenience store with barred windows, a laundromat where Spanish music drifted through open doors, and several small businesses that seemed to exist in the margins of the city's consciousness. Mark followed his wife through these explorations, with the weary patience of someone who had learned that resistance only amplified Laura's obsessive energy. He watched her approach strangers with Emily's photograph, witnessed the polite headshakes and apologetic expressions that had become so familiar over the past 2 years. Yet something about San Diego felt different to him, though he could not articulate exactly what had changed. Perhaps it was the way Laura moved through these streets with renewed purpose, or perhaps it was simply that being so far from home made every interaction feel charged with possibility. Their systematic canvassing of the neighborhood eventually led them to a building that seemed to exist in defiance of its surroundings. While the street was lined with the usual urban mixture of small businesses and apartment buildings showing their age, this structure stood out like a beacon of intentional difference. The building had once been a small warehouse, its industrial bones still visible beneath a transformation that spoke of careful planning and significant resources. The exterior walls had been painted a warm cream color that seemed to glow against the marine layer, while large windows had been installed where loading docks once existed, flooding the interior with natural light that felt almost sacred. A simple wooden sign beside the entrance read, "New Covenant Community Fellowship," in elegant script that suggested both humility and quiet confidence. Below the name, smaller text proclaimed "All are welcome" in multiple languages, including Spanish, Vietnamese, and what Laura recognized as Arabic script. The building emanated a sense of purposeful activity even from the sidewalk, with the sound of multiple voices raised in what might have been prayer or song, drifting through the partially open windows. Laura's internal compass, the same instinct that had led her to the Google Maps image, began resonating with increasing intensity as they approached the building. She felt drawn toward this place in a way that bypassed rational analysis, as if invisible threads were pulling her toward answers she had been seeking for 2 years. Mark sensed his wife's heightened alertness and found himself unconsciously scanning their surroundings with the tactical awareness of his firefighting training, noting exit routes and potential dangers even as he told himself they were simply visiting a church. The interior of the New Covenant Community Fellowship challenged every assumption Laura had developed about religious spaces during her years at Cedar Ridge Community Church. Instead of traditional pews, the main sanctuary contained an eclectic collection of comfortable chairs, couches, and floor cushions arranged in loose circles that suggested intimate conversation rather than formal worship. The walls displayed artwork that appeared to have been created by community members, vibrant paintings that mixed Christian symbolism with cultural influences from around the world, creating a visual tapestry that spoke of inclusion and acceptance. The demographic composition of the congregation was unlike anything Laura had encountered in her small Texas town. Families from what appeared to be dozens of different cultural backgrounds moved through the space with the easy familiarity of people who had found belonging in unexpected places. Teenagers with tattoos and piercings sat beside elderly women in traditional dress, while young families with children speaking multiple languages created a gentle cacophony of human connection that felt both chaotic and harmonious. Pastor Elias emerged from this diverse community like a figure designed to put visitors at ease. His appearance struck a careful balance between approachable and authoritative, tall enough to command attention, but not so imposing as to intimidate, with silver-streaked brown hair that suggested wisdom without indicating old age. His clothing reflected the same calculated informality as his building's design. Dark jeans paired with a button-down shirt that was expensive enough to suggest success, but casual enough to avoid pretension. When he smiled, which seemed to be his default expression, his entire face transformed in a way that made strangers feel as though they were reuniting with an old friend. His approach to Laura and Mark demonstrated a social intelligence that immediately put them off balance. Rather than the formal greeting they might have expected from a religious leader, Pastor Elias moved toward them with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent years reading people's emotional needs from across crowded rooms. His handshake lingered just long enough to feel personal without crossing into inappropriate territory, while his eyes maintained the kind of direct contact that suggested complete attention to their presence. When Laura began explaining their situation, Pastor Elias's response demonstrated a masterful understanding of human psychology. He listened with the focused intensity of a trained counselor, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding that encouraged her to continue. His body language suggested complete engagement with their story. Leaning slightly forward, his hands folded in a gesture that conveyed both patience and concern. his facial expressions mirroring the emotional content of Laura's words in ways that made her feel truly heard for the first time in months. The pastor's offer of assistance came wrapped in language that seemed designed to appeal specifically to Laura's spiritual worldview. He spoke of divine providence in mysterious ways, of how God often brought lost souls together in unexpected circumstances, of how their congregation specialized in helping people who had fallen through society's cracks. His voice carried the kind of trained modulation that suggested years of public speaking experience, smooth and warm like honey, capable of making even casual observations sound profound and meaningful. But beneath the surface of Pastor Elias's perfect pastoral demeanor, Laura began detecting subtle discordances that triggered her maternal alarm systems. His questions about Emily felt slightly too specific, as if he was fishing for particular types of information rather than simply expressing general concern. He wanted to know about Emily's relationship with her parents, about any difficulties she might have been experiencing at home, about her level of religious faith and involvement with their Texas church. Each question was delivered with apparent innocence, wrapped in the kind of pastoral concern that would have seemed natural in any other context. The pastor's inquiries about their family's spiritual life carried undertones that made Laura increasingly uncomfortable, though she struggled to articulate exactly what felt wrong. He asked about their prayer life, about how their faith had sustained them through Emily's disappearance, about whether they had considered that perhaps God was using their daughter's absence to test their commitment to his plan. The questions themselves were not inappropriate for a religious leader, but something in the way he asked them suggested an agenda that extended beyond simple pastoral care. Mark, meanwhile, observed the interaction with the detached analysis of someone who had never shared his wife's deep religious convictions. From his perspective, Pastor Elias appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be: a charismatic religious leader who had built an impressive community organization. Yet Mark could not ignore the subtle signs of tension he was reading in Laura's body language. Her shoulders had become rigid in the way they did when she was fighting internal alarms, while her hands had begun unconsciously gripping Emily's photograph with increasing intensity. The pastor's office, where he eventually invited them for a more private conversation, reflected the same careful balance between spiritual authority and approachable humanity that characterized his personal presentation. The space contained all the expected elements of a religious leader's workspace: theological books lining built-in shelves, framed certificates indicating various educational achievements, inspirational artwork featuring biblical scenes and motivational quotes. Yet something about the arrangement felt calculated, as if each element had been chosen for its psychological impact rather than personal meaning. As their conversation deepened, Pastor Elias began sharing selected details about his congregation's work with displaced youth, describing their outreach programs and residential facilities with the kind of practiced fluency that suggested frequent repetition. He spoke of young people who had found new purpose through his ministry, of families reunited through the power of faith, of God's ability to transform even the most desperate circumstances into opportunities for spiritual growth. His stories were compelling and emotionally resonant, yet Laura found herself analyzing each anecdote for the specific details that seemed suspiciously absent. The pastor's questions about their travel plans and intended length of stay in San Diego struck Laura as unnecessarily thorough for someone offering simple assistance. He wanted to know where they were staying, how long they could afford to remain in the city, whether they had contacted local law enforcement about Emily's potential presence in the area. Again, each question could be justified as natural curiosity or practical concern, but taken together, they created a pattern that made Laura's instincts scream warnings she could not yet fully understand. Throughout the extended conversation, Laura found herself studying Pastor Elias's mannerisms with increasing intensity. She noticed how his smile never quite reached his eyes when he thought no one was looking directly at him. She observed the way his hands moved with practiced gestures that seemed designed to convey trustworthiness and spiritual authority. Most unsettling of all, she began detecting moments when his carefully maintained pastoral persona seemed to slip slightly, revealing glimpses of something harder and more calculating beneath the surface warmth. The growing tension between what Pastor Elias said and what Laura sensed created a cognitive dissonance that left her feeling simultaneously grateful for his offered assistance and deeply suspicious of his motives. Every rational analysis of their interaction suggested that they had encountered exactly the kind of helpful religious leader they needed to aid their search. Yet every maternal instinct that had driven her to San Diego was now screaming that this man represented a threat she did not yet understand, but could not afford to ignore. The moment that shattered Laura's world arrived with the deceptive quietness of a pin drop in a cathedral. Pastor Elias had been gesturing toward a wall display of photographs, showing various community outreach activities, his arm extended in a sweeping motion, meant to encompass the scope of his ministry's work. As he moved, the afternoon sunlight streaming through his office window caught something at his throat, creating a brief flash of silver that drew Laura's attention with magnetic intensity. Hanging from a thin chain around Pastor Elias's neck was a pendant that made Laura's blood turn to ice water in her veins. The piece was small and delicate, barely an inch across, crafted from what appeared to be sterling silver with intricate detailing that spoke of careful artisanship. It was a butterfly, its wings spread in eternal flight, with tiny engravings that created texture and depth across its surface. Each wing featured a pattern of small holes and raised elements that caught the light and created shadows, giving the piece an almost living quality as it moved with the pastor's breathing. Laura's vision tunneled until the entire universe contracted to that single silver butterfly, and her mind exploded with memories so vivid they felt like physical blows. Emily's 13th birthday, 18 months before her disappearance, when Laura and Mark had taken her to the local crafts fair held annually in Cedar Ridge's town square. Emily had been drawn immediately to a jewelry booth run by an elderly Native American artisan named Joseph Crow Feather, whose work reflected a lifetime of metalsmithing mastery, passed down through generations. The butterfly pendant had been displayed among dozens of other pieces, but Emily's eyes had locked onto it with the kind of immediate recognition that transcends rational choice. She had stood transfixed before the display case, her teenage fingers pressed against the glass, while Joseph explained the symbolism behind the piece. The butterfly, he had told her in his gentle, weathered voice, represented transformation and renewal, the soul's journey from one state of being to another. For Emily, who was navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence, the metaphor had resonated with profound meaning. Laura remembered every detail of that transaction with crystalline clarity. Mark had initially balked at the price, $45, representing a significant expense for their family budget at the time. But Emily's face had held such longing, such pure desire for this one beautiful thing, that both parents had melted. They had pooled their cash and bought the pendant as an early birthday gift, watching Emily's face illuminate with joy that made the sacrifice feel insignificant. Emily had attached the butterfly to her school backpack immediately, refusing Laura's suggestion that such a delicate piece should be saved for special occasions. She wanted to carry it with her everywhere, she had insisted, because it reminded her that she was changing and growing into someone new. The pendant had become part of Emily's daily armor, a talisman she touched when nervous before tests or when facing the social challenges that came with being 14 years old in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The morning Emily disappeared, Laura had watched her daughter grab that same backpack, the silver butterfly catching the kitchen light as Emily slung it over her shoulder and headed toward a day that would end with her vanishing from the world. The pendant had been specifically mentioned in every missing person report, described in detail on every flyer they had posted around Cedar Ridge and beyond. It was one of the few truly unique identifying features that could definitively connect any found remains or recovered belongings to their missing daughter. Now, seeing that same butterfly hanging around Pastor Elias's neck felt like witnessing a resurrection that had gone horribly wrong. Laura's hands began trembling with such violence that she had to grip the arms of her chair to prevent herself from betraying the earthquake of recognition that was tearing through her consciousness. Her breathing became shallow and rapid as adrenaline flooded her system, triggering every fight-or-flight response evolution had programmed into human physiology. The pastor continued talking, his voice becoming distant and muffled as Laura's auditory processing shut down to focus entirely on visual analysis of the pendant. She studied every detail with the intensity of a forensic investigator, comparing the piece around his neck to her memories of Emily's treasure. The size was exactly right, perhaps 1.25 inches from wingtip to wingtip. The intricate engravings matched perfectly, including a small imperfection near the left wing that Joseph Crow Feather had pointed out as evidence of the piece's handmade authenticity. Most damning of all was a tiny scratch across the butterfly's body that Laura remembered Emily acquiring during a camping trip the previous summer. Emily had been climbing over fallen logs while exploring a creek bed, and the pendant had scraped against rough bark, leaving a thin line that Emily had initially been devastated about. Laura had comforted her daughter by explaining that the scratch was now part of the butterfly's story, a mark that made it uniquely Emily's. That same scratch was clearly visible on the pendant hanging around Pastor Elias's throat. Mark, seated beside Laura, initially remained oblivious to the seismic shift occurring in his wife's perception of their situation. He was still processing Pastor Elias's words about community outreach and residential programs, analyzing the information with the methodical approach of someone trained to assess situations for potential hazards. But gradually, Mark's peripheral awareness registered the change in Laura's breathing pattern, and the rigid tension that had transformed her posture from attentive interest to predatory alertness. Pastor Elias, meanwhile, seemed to sense the atmospheric shift in his office without understanding its source. His practiced pastoral demeanor began showing hairline cracks as he registered Laura's changed energy, though he could not identify what had triggered her transformation. His gestures became slightly more controlled, his smile requiring more conscious effort to maintain, while his eyes began darting between Laura and Mark with increasing frequency, as if trying to decode the sudden tension that had entered their conversation. Laura's maternal instincts, already heightened by 2 years of desperate searching, began operating at a level of intensity that felt almost supernatural. Every detail of Pastor Elias's appearance and behavior came into sharp focus, as her mind automatically cataloged potential threats and escape routes. She noticed how his fingers had begun unconsciously touching the pendant, as if seeking comfort from its presence. She observed the way his breathing had become slightly more rapid, matching her own elevated state without his conscious awareness. Most significantly, she detected a subtle shift in his vocal patterns, as his carefully modulated pastoral tone began carrying undertones of something that might have been nervousness, or might have been something far more dangerous. The pastor's responses to their questions began changing in ways that would have been imperceptible to someone not operating in Laura's heightened state of awareness. His answers became fractionally more evasive, his eye contact less consistent, his gestures more rehearsed and less natural. When Laura asked about the pendant directly, commenting on its beauty with forced casualness, Pastor Elias's hand moved instinctively to cover it, while his explanation about receiving it as a gift from a grateful parishioner sounded hollow and overly detailed in the way that fabricated stories often do. Laura's mind began racing through calculations and possibilities with the speed of pure panic channeled into analytical thinking. If Pastor Elias had Emily's butterfly pendant, the logical explanations were limited and uniformly horrifying. Either he had taken it from Emily directly, or he had obtained it from someone who had taken it from her, or Emily had given it to him under circumstances that Laura could not bear to fully contemplate. None of these possibilities suggested that Emily was safe, or that Pastor Elias was the helpful religious leader he appeared to be. The atmosphere in the office began to feel charged with unspoken knowledge and barely contained emotions. Laura fought to maintain her composure while every instinct screamed at her to grab the pendant from around the pastor's neck and demand explanations that he was clearly not prepared to provide. Mark's firefighter training began kicking in as he recognized the signs of a situation spiraling toward potential confrontation, though he still did not understand what had triggered Laura's transformation from hopeful parent to something approaching a predator protecting her territory. Pastor Elias's carefully constructed persona continued deteriorating in almost imperceptible increments. His professional warmth began feeling forced and artificial, like a mask that no longer fit properly over features that wanted to express something entirely different. His questions about their plans and timeline became more insistent, his suggestions about other places they might search for. Emily carrying undertones that sounded less like helpfulness and more like misdirection. Most unnervingly, his eyes began holding Laura's gaze for periods that felt uncomfortably long, as if he were trying to read her thoughts or assess her level of suspicion. The pendant continued catching the light with each of Pastor Elias's movements, creating intermittent flashes that felt like Morse code signals spelling out messages Laura was terrified to decode. Each glint of silver reinforced her growing certainty that she was sitting across from the person responsible for Emily's disappearance, that the helpful pastor offering assistance was actually the predator who had destroyed their family 2 years earlier. The cognitive dissonance between his maintained facade of spiritual authority and her growing awareness of his true nature created a psychological tension that felt physically painful. Laura's hands began moving unconsciously toward her purse, where she carried copies of Emily's missing person flyers, with detailed descriptions of the butterfly pendant. Part of her wanted to produce the documentation immediately and confront Pastor Elias with irrefutable evidence of his deception. But a deeper survival instinct warned her that revealing her knowledge too soon could put not only herself and Mark in danger, but might also eliminate any chance of finding Emily if she was still alive somewhere within reach of this man's influence. The realization that Emily might be nearby, possibly within this very building or somewhere in Pastor Elias's network of facilities, sent another wave of adrenaline through Laura's system. Her eyes began unconsciously scanning the office for signs of recent teenage presence. Additional personal items that might belong to Emily, photographs that might include familiar faces, anything that could provide clues about where her daughter might be hidden. The thought that she might be mere yards away from Emily, after 2 years of desperate searching, created an almost unbearable tension between hope and terror. Mark finally began recognizing the signs of Laura's internal crisis, noting the way her breathing had become shallow and rapid, the rigid set of her shoulders, and the predatory alertness in her posture that he had never seen before in their 20-year marriage. His own adrenaline began rising in response to her obvious distress, while his mind raced to understand what had triggered such a dramatic change in what had seemed like a routine conversation with a helpful religious leader. The atmosphere in Pastor Elias's office had transformed from welcoming to threatening in ways that Mark's emergency response training told him indicated imminent danger, though he could not yet identify the specific threat they were facing. The decision to follow Pastor Elias rather than wait for police intervention crystallized in Laura's mind, with the brutal clarity of maternal desperation. Every second spent explaining their suspicions to skeptical detectives, every moment lost to bureaucratic procedures and proper protocols, represented another opportunity for Emily to vanish again, potentially forever this time. Mark watched his wife's transformation from grieving mother to something approaching a force of nature, recognizing that no argument could dissuade her from pursuing what might be their only chance to recover their daughter. Their hasty departure from the New Covenant Community Fellowship required the kind of careful orchestration that neither Laura nor Mark had experience with. Yet desperation provided a crash course in surveillance techniques. They retreated to their rental car with forced casualness, Laura's hands shaking so violently that Mark had to take the keys while she struggled to appear normal to anyone who might be watching from the church building's windows. The marine layer that had greeted their arrival in San Diego had begun lifting, revealing a California afternoon sun that felt harsh and unforgiving against their Texas pale skin. Mark positioned their vehicle 3 blocks away from the fellowship building, close enough to maintain visual contact, but distant enough to avoid detection by Pastor Elias or any of his associates who might be trained to spot surveillance. Laura armed herself with a pair of small binoculars they had purchased for birdwatching during happier times, back when family vacations involved national parks instead of missing person investigations. Through the magnified lenses, she could observe the church entrance while Mark monitored their surroundings for any signs that they had been noticed. The waiting period stretched endlessly, each minute feeling like an hour as Laura's adrenaline-fueled system struggled to maintain alertness without burning through her remaining emotional reserves. She found herself memorizing every detail of the church building's facade, counting windows and noting the positions of security cameras that might have captured Emily's presence. Mark maintained radio contact with Detective Rodriguez from the San Diego Police Department, providing updates on their location while carefully omitting their true intentions, knowing that any official would order them to cease their amateur surveillance immediately. Pastor Elias emerged from the fellowship building at precisely 4:30 in the afternoon, his departure timed with the mechanical precision of someone following a predetermined schedule. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she watched him through the binoculars, noting how his carefully maintained pastoral demeanor had been replaced by something more businesslike and urgent. He moved with purpose, rather than the leisurely grace he had displayed during their earlier encounter, his eyes scanning the surrounding streets with the cautious awareness of someone who understood the importance of remaining unobserved. The pastor's vehicle proved to be a white panel van with New Covenant Community Fellowship logos painted discreetly on both sides, the kind of innocuous transportation that could move through urban environments without attracting attention. Laura recognized the tactical brilliance of hiding in plain sight, using the respectability associated with religious organizations to deflect suspicion from activities that might otherwise raise red flags. As Pastor Elias pulled away from the church, Mark started their rental car and began following at a distance that balanced visibility with discretion. The pursuit through San Diego's afternoon traffic required every ounce of Mark's emergency vehicle operation training, adapted for the unfamiliar challenge of covert surveillance. He maintained a 3-car buffer between their rental and Pastor Elias's van, using other vehicles as visual screens while tracking their target through a maze of surface streets that seemed designed to confuse outsiders. Laura navigated using her smartphone's GPS, while simultaneously monitoring police scanner applications that might indicate whether their activities had been detected by law enforcement. Pastor Elias's route took them through increasingly residential neighborhoods, away from the commercial districts and tourist areas that characterized most visitors' experience of San Diego. The houses grew smaller and more weathered as they traveled, reflecting economic demographics that suggested this area received less city maintenance and fewer resources than the coastal communities that generated tourism revenue. Laura noted the prevalence of Spanish-language signage and the evidence of multi-generational families sharing single-family homes, recognizing that they were entering communities where people might be less likely to interact voluntarily with authorities. Their destination revealed itself as a modest 2-story building that occupied a corner lot in a neighborhood where such facilities could operate without attracting unwanted attention from affluent residents concerned about property values. The structure bore a small sign identifying it as New Horizons Youth Center, with additional text indicating it provided temporary housing and support services for displaced minors. The building's exterior showed signs of careful maintenance despite obvious budget constraints, with fresh paint covering older architectural bones and a small garden that suggested someone cared about creating a welcoming environment. Mark parked their rental car a block away, positioning them where they could observe the youth center's main entrance, while remaining hidden behind a line of mature jacaranda trees that provided natural camouflage. Laura's binoculars revealed details that made her heart race with anticipation and terror. Through the building's large front windows, she could see movement that indicated significant activity inside, with multiple figures moving back and forth carrying what appeared to be luggage and travel supplies. The scene that unfolded before them felt like watching a theatrical production where they could see the action but not hear the dialogue that would explain the plot. Pastor Elias emerged from his van and was immediately joined by a woman who appeared to be in her 40s, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and clothing that suggested administrative authority rather than direct care responsibilities. Laura would later learn that this was Iris Blackwood, Pastor Elias's primary assistant, and the person responsible for managing the day-to-day operations of his various facilities. Iris moved with the efficient precision of someone coordinating a complex logistical operation, checking items off a clipboard while directing the loading of supplies into Pastor Elias's van and a second vehicle that had been parked behind the youth center. Laura watched through her binoculars as boxes and suitcases emerged from the building, noting that the quantity of materials suggested a major relocation rather than a simple day trip. Her maternal instincts screamed that whatever was happening represented a critical moment in Emily's fate, that missing this opportunity might mean losing their daughter forever. The children began emerging from the youth center in small groups, each accompanied by an adult who maintained the kind of close supervision that could be interpreted as either protective care or security measures depending on one's perspective. Laura's trained teacher's eye automatically began counting and categorizing what she observed. Approximately 12 young people ranging in apparent age from early teens to late adolescence, representing diverse ethnic backgrounds that reflected San Diego's metropolitan demographics. Most carried small bags or backpacks, suggesting they were being relocated with only minimal personal possessions. Then Laura saw her, and the world stopped rotating on its axis. Emily Peterson stepped through the youth center's front door wearing the burgundy hooded sweatshirt that Laura had knitted with her own hands 2.5 years earlier. The garment had faded slightly from its original rich color and showed signs of regular wear, but every detail remained exactly as Laura remembered from countless hours of careful stitching. Emily's brown hair had grown longer and was now pulled back in a ponytail that revealed a face that had matured from childhood into the early stages of young womanhood. But her distinctive profile remained unmistakably the daughter who had vanished from Cedar Ridge so long ago. Around Emily's neck hung the silver butterfly pendant that had been the source of Laura's suspicions, its familiar shape catching the afternoon sunlight exactly as it had during that long-ago camping trip, when the scratch across its body had seemed like such a tragedy. Emily touched the pendant unconsciously as she walked, a gesture so characteristic and deeply familiar that Laura felt 2 years of grief and desperate hope explode simultaneously in her chest, like competing fireworks displays. Mark's sharp intake of breath indicated that he too had recognized their daughter, his firefighters' trained observation skills confirming what Laura's maternal instincts had been screaming. Emily appeared physically healthy, walking without signs of injury or obvious distress, but something in her posture and movement patterns suggested psychological changes that neither parent was prepared to process. She moved with the careful watchfulness of someone who had learned to monitor her environment for potential threats, her eyes scanning surroundings in ways that their carefree 14-year-old daughter would never have needed to develop. The group dynamics surrounding Emily revealed themselves through subtle interactions that Laura dissected with microscopic intensity. Emily remained close to two other teenage girls who appeared to be roughly her age, their body language suggesting friendships that had developed through shared circumstances rather than natural affinity. An older boy, perhaps 17 or 18, maintained a protective position near the three girls that could have indicated either genuine care or assignment to monitor them. Adult supervisors distributed themselves throughout the group with strategic positioning that ensured no young person was ever far from oversight. Pastor Elias moved through the assembled children with practiced ease, his interactions suggesting established relationships built over time, rather than recent acquaintance. He spoke briefly with each young person, his gestures conveying reassurance and authority in equal measure, while his eyes continuously scanned the surrounding area with the vigilance of someone aware that his activities might attract unwanted attention. When he reached Emily, Laura watched through her binoculars as their daughter responded to whatever he said with a nod that seemed automatic, rather than enthusiastic, the kind of compliance that suggested learned behavior, rather than genuine agreement. Iris coordinated the loading process with military efficiency, directing children toward specific vehicles while checking names against her clipboard and ensuring that luggage was distributed according to some predetermined system. Laura noted that Emily was assigned to Pastor Elias's van along with 5 other young people, a selection that appeared random, but might have reflected strategic considerations about which children required the most direct supervision. The loading process proceeded with the smooth coordination of a frequently repeated procedure, suggesting that relocating groups of children was a regular aspect of Pastor Elias's operations. The moment when Emily climbed into Pastor Elias's van triggered a psychological earthquake in both of her parents that threatened to overwhelm their ability to think strategically about rescue operations. Laura's vision began tunneling as 2 years of suppressed panic finally found expression, while Mark's hands gripped their rental car's steering wheel with enough force to leave permanent impressions in the synthetic material. The sight of their daughter disappearing into a vehicle controlled by the person they now knew had stolen her from their family ignited every protective instinct evolution had programmed into human parents, creating an almost irresistible urge to abandon caution and storm the van immediately. Only the recognition that premature action might result in Emily's disappearance again, this time permanently, provided enough restraint to keep Laura and Mark in position while the convoy prepared for departure. They watched Pastor Elias perform a final check of his passengers, noting how his interactions with the children reflected practiced authority rather than genuine care, before taking his position behind the wheel and starting the van's engine. Iris climbed into the second vehicle after completing her own passenger count, and both vehicles began moving toward the street with the coordinated precision of a well-rehearsed operation. As the convoy pulled away from the youth center, Laura felt the full weight of 2 years' worth of grief, hope, rage, and desperate love colliding in her chest like tectonic plates shifting to accommodate seismic pressure. Emily was alive, healthy enough to walk and interact normally, and close enough that Laura could have called her name if she had been willing to risk everything on a single desperate gesture. But Emily was also clearly under the control of someone who had deceived them for hours while wearing her daughter's pendant around his neck like a trophy. Someone whose smooth pastoral facade concealed activities that required relocating children under conditions that suggested they were not free to leave if they chose. The sight of Emily climbing into that van awakened something primal and unstoppable in both parents. A recognition that their long search was ending, but their most dangerous challenge was just beginning. The confrontation erupted in the parking lot of a roadside rest stop where Pastor Elias had pulled his convoy to allow the children a bathroom break during their journey to an unknown destination. Laura and Mark had been following the 2-vehicle caravan for nearly 40 minutes, through increasingly rural areas outside San Diego, watching helplessly as Emily disappeared further from civilization with each passing mile. The rest stop represented their first opportunity to act without risking a high-speed chase that could endanger not only Emily, but the other children trapped in Pastor Elias's web of deception. Mark had been secretly coordinating with Detective Carter of the San Diego Police Department throughout their surveillance operation, using a hands-free device to provide location updates while maintaining the pretense of amateur parent investigators. The detective had initially been skeptical of their claims about Pastor Elias and the butterfly pendant, but Mark's systematic documentation of the convoy's route and the presence of multiple children being transported under suspicious circumstances had finally convinced law enforcement to mobilize response units. Police vehicles were converging on their location from multiple directions. But Mark and Laura could not wait for official backup when they saw Emily climbing out of the van just 30 yards away from where they had concealed their rental car. The moment Laura saw her daughter's face in full daylight for the first time in 2 years, every rational consideration about safety and proper procedure evaporated from her consciousness, like morning mist exposed to desert heat. Emily looked older, more cautious, with an alertness in her posture that spoke of hard lessons learned during her absence from their family. She moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned to conserve energy and avoid attracting unwanted attention, her eyes constantly scanning her environment in ways that their carefree 14-year-old daughter would never have needed to develop. But she was unmistakably alive, unmistakably their Emily, wearing the burgundy sweatshirt that represented countless hours of Laura's love translated into careful stitches. Laura's exit from their rental car occurred with explosive suddenness that caught Mark completely off guard. One moment she had been sitting rigid with tension in the passenger seat, and the next she was sprinting across the asphalt with the desperate speed of a mother whose child was drowning just beyond her reach. Her voice, when she finally found it, carried 2 years of accumulated grief and desperate hope, compressed into a single word that echoed across the rest stop like a battle cry. Emily's name erupted from Laura's throat with enough force to stop conversations and turn heads throughout the facility, transforming what had been a routine travel break into the epicenter of a family drama that was about to explode into criminal investigation. Emily's reaction to hearing her mother's voice was immediate and devastating. Her entire body went rigid as if struck by lightning, while her face cycled through expressions of disbelief, recognition, hope, and terror in rapid succession. For a moment that stretched like eternity, mother and daughter stared at each other across 30 yards of cracked asphalt. 2 years of separation collapsing into a single moment of mutual recognition that neither had dared to hope for. Then Emily was moving, her careful composure shattering as she ran toward Laura with the awkward desperation of someone who had almost forgotten how to trust that good things could actually happen. Pastor Elias's transformation from caring religious leader to something far more dangerous occurred with shocking rapidity. The moment he heard Laura's voice calling Emily's name, his entire demeanor shifted like a mask being torn away to reveal the predator beneath. His pastoral warmth disappeared completely, replaced by the cold calculation of someone whose carefully constructed deception had just been exposed. His eyes darted frantically around the rest stop, assessing escape routes and potential threats with the tactical awareness of someone who had obviously prepared for the possibility that his activities might eventually attract unwanted attention. Iris reacted to the crisis with practiced efficiency that suggested this was not the first time their operations had been compromised. She immediately began herding the other children back toward the vehicles with sharp gestures and urgent whispers, her administrative facade dropping to reveal something harder and more controlling underneath. Several of the older teenagers seemed confused by the sudden change in atmosphere, while others appeared resigned in ways that suggested they had witnessed similar situations before. The complex dynamics of Pastor Elias's operation began revealing themselves through the children's varied reactions to crisis, some showing genuine fear, while others displayed the emotional numbness of people who had learned not to expect good outcomes. Mark's approach to the confrontation reflected his firefighter training adapted for a situation no emergency response manual had ever covered. He moved with deliberate purpose rather than Laura's emotional explosion, positioning himself to cut off Pastor Elias's most obvious escape routes, while maintaining enough distance to avoid immediate physical confrontation. His years of emergency response experience had taught him that panicked people made dangerous decisions, and everything about Pastor Elias's body language suggested someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him in ways that might provoke desperate action. The physical reunion between Laura and Emily occurred in the middle of the rest stop parking lot with an intensity that seemed to bend reality around them. When Emily finally reached her mother, both women collapsed into each other with the force of 2 years' worth of suppressed emotion, finding simultaneous release. Laura's hands moved frantically over Emily's face and hair, as if trying to confirm through touch that her daughter was real and solid, rather than another cruel dream. Emily clung to her mother with desperate strength, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking to reveal the frightened teenager, who had been hiding beneath layers of psychological protection. Pastor Elias's attempt at escape began with calculated calmness that quickly deteriorated into obvious panic. He started walking toward his van with forced casualness, as if he could somehow convince observers that nothing unusual was happening, despite the clearly emotional reunion taking place just yards away. But as Mark began closing the distance between them with obvious intent, Pastor Elias's facade of control crumbled completely. He broke into a run that revealed the athletic build hidden beneath his carefully chosen pastoral clothing, his movements showing the desperation of someone who understood that capture meant the end of whatever life he had built through deception. Mark's interception of Pastor Elias's escape attempt drew upon every technique he had learned during his firefighter training about controlling panicked individuals in emergency situations. He tackled the fleeing man with enough force to send both of them sprawling across the asphalt, using his superior size and training to maintain control, despite Pastor Elias's frantic struggles. The physical confrontation was brief but violent, with Pastor Elias displaying a viciousness that confirmed Laura's instincts about the danger he represented to vulnerable children. Mark's experience with restraining people in crisis situations proved crucial as he pinned Pastor Elias to the ground while they waited for police backup to arrive. The arrival of Detective Carter and his tactical support team transformed the rest stop into a crime scene with military efficiency. Squad cars emerged from multiple directions with sirens wailing and lights flashing, creating a perimeter that ensured no one could escape while evidence was secured and witnesses were separated for individual questioning. Detective Carter himself proved to be a seasoned investigator, whose weathered face and careful eyes suggested decades of experience with cases involving missing children and the predators who targeted them. His immediate focus on securing Emily's safety and medical evaluation demonstrated professional competence that helped Laura and Mark begin trusting that their nightmare might finally be ending. The revelation of Pastor Elias's true identity emerged through Detective Carter's preliminary investigation, with the systematic precision of a criminal profile being assembled in real time. Fingerprint analysis revealed that the man they had known as Pastor Elias was actually Tobias Quinn, a career criminal whose activities had been the subject of multi-state investigation for over 5 years. Quinn's criminal history painted a picture of someone who had perfected the use of religious authority as camouflage for predatory behavior, establishing fake ministries and youth programs as cover for human trafficking operations that had victimized dozens of vulnerable children across the western United States. Detective Carter's briefing revealed the scope of Quinn's operation, with details that made Laura's stomach turn and her protective instincts surge with renewed intensity. The New Covenant Community Fellowship was just one of several fake religious organizations Quinn had established to provide legitimacy for his activities, each one carefully designed to appeal to both potential victims and the communities where he operated. His selection of vulnerable teenagers followed predictable patterns, targeting young people who were isolated from support systems and desperate for belonging and acceptance. The residential facilities like the New Horizons Youth Center served as temporary holding locations where children could be processed and prepared for transportation to final destinations that Detective Carter was still working to identify. The other children rescued from Quinn's convoy represented a cross-section of America's most vulnerable young people. Runaways fleeing abuse, aged-out foster children with nowhere to go, homeless teenagers who had been surviving on the streets until Quinn's recruiters offered them food and shelter in exchange for compliance with his program. Each child's story revealed a different pathway into Quinn's web, but all shared common elements of isolation and desperation that had made them susceptible to his carefully crafted appeals to their need for family and purpose. Detective Carter's team began the delicate process of identifying each child and locating family members or appropriate placement facilities, a task complicated by the fact that many had been missing for months or even years. Emily's initial interview with Detective Carter provided crucial intelligence about Quinn's methods while revealing the psychological manipulation she had endured during her captivity. Her testimony, delivered in halting whispers while Laura held her hand, described a systematic program of isolation and indoctrination designed to break down existing identities and replace them with absolute dependence on Quinn's authority. The children in his program were taught that their previous lives had been failures and that only complete surrender to his guidance could provide them with purpose and belonging. Those who resisted faced psychological punishment designed to crush their will, while those who complied were rewarded with small privileges that created artificial gratitude for basic human needs. The butterfly pendant's significance became clear through Emily's explanation of how Quinn used personal items from his victims as psychological tools to maintain control. Each child was required to surrender something meaningful from their previous life, which Quinn would then display as evidence of their commitment to their new existence under his authority. The pendants, jewelry, photographs, and other mementos served as both trophies for Quinn and reminders to the children that their past identities had been sacrificed for their current situation. Emily's butterfly had been particularly significant because its beauty and craftsmanship made it a prized possession that Quinn wore personally, rather than simply storing with other confiscated items. Iris Blackwood's arrest revealed another layer of Quinn's operation, as Detective Carter's investigation uncovered her role as both administrative coordinator and psychological enforcer for the various facilities. Her background included legitimate social work training that had provided her with professional credibility, while also giving her detailed knowledge of how to manipulate vulnerable children using approved therapeutic techniques twisted to serve Quinn's purposes. Her methodical documentation of each child's psychological profile and behavioral patterns had created a database that allowed Quinn to customize his manipulation strategies for maximum effectiveness, turning legitimate social work principles into tools for exploitation. The scope of Quinn's criminal enterprise continued expanding as Detective Carter's team analyzed evidence seized from the vehicles and coordinated with federal agencies investigating similar operations across multiple states. Financial records revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that used donations to fake religious organizations to fund the purchase and maintenance of properties used for housing kidnapped children. Communication logs showed connections to other criminal organizations involved in human trafficking, suggesting that Quinn's operation was part of a larger network that moved vulnerable young people across state lines for purposes that Detective Carter was still working to fully understand. As the immediate crisis at the rest stop was brought under control and Emily was finally secure in her parents' protective embrace, the true magnitude of what they had stumbled into began revealing itself through Detective Carter's ongoing investigation. Their desperate search for one missing daughter had uncovered a criminal operation that had destroyed dozens of families and victimized vulnerable children across multiple states. Quinn's arrest would trigger investigations that would continue for months, as law enforcement agencies worked to identify all of his victims and dismantle the network of facilities and associates that had enabled his crimes to continue for so long. The aftermath unfolded in the sterile corridors of San Diego General Hospital, where Emily underwent comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations, while Laura and Mark waited in a family consultation room that had witnessed countless similar reunions between loved ones and trauma. The hospital's victim advocacy team had arranged for privacy and security, recognizing that the Peterson family needed time to process 2 years of separation without the intrusion of media attention or curious observers. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the steady persistence of institutional functionality, while vending machine coffee provided bitter comfort to parents who had forgotten how to imagine their story ending with anything other than perpetual searching. Emily's physical examination revealed the complex story of her captivity written across her body in ways that would require months or even years to fully understand. She had grown 3 inches during her absence, her teenage frame stretching into young womanhood under circumstances that no parent should ever have to contemplate. Small scars on her hands and arms told stories of work assignments and living conditions that Detective Carter's investigation would eventually uncover, while her overall health suggested that Quinn had maintained his victim's physical condition for reasons that remained part of the ongoing criminal investigation. The burgundy sweatshirt, carefully removed by medical staff and preserved as evidence, bore stains and wear patterns that represented nearly 2 years of serving as Emily's primary connection to the mother who had never stopped searching for her. Laura's reunion with her daughter transcended the simple physical embrace they had shared in the rest stop parking lot, evolving into a careful reconstruction of maternal connection that had been severed by violence and sustained by pure determination. She found herself studying Emily's face with the intensity of someone memorizing a masterpiece, cataloging each subtle change that marked the passage from the carefree 14-year-old who had vanished into the guarded 16-year-old who had somehow survived Quinn's manipulation. Emily's eyes held depths that spoke of experiences Laura could barely imagine, while her speech patterns had acquired a careful precision that suggested hard-learned lessons about the importance of choosing words wisely. The hospital's family room became a sacred space where three people began the delicate process of becoming a family again, after trauma had torn them apart and time had changed them in ways that none of them fully understood yet. Laura sat close enough to maintain physical contact with Emily at all times, her hand resting on her daughter's arm or shoulder with the gentle persistence of someone confirming reality through touch. Emily's responses to her mother's presence fluctuated between desperate gratitude and the kind of wariness that indicated her captivity had taught her to be suspicious of kindness, even from people she recognized as safe. Her fingers worried constantly at the chain around her neck, where Quinn had forced her to wear the butterfly pendant as a symbol of her captivity, rather than the celebration of transformation it had originally represented. Mark's emotional journey during those first hours of reunion revealed the depth of grief and guilt he had been carrying throughout their 2-year search. His pragmatic approach to Emily's disappearance, which had seemed like mature acceptance of harsh reality, crumbled completely when confronted with the evidence that Laura's seemingly irrational hope had been justified all along. He found himself unable to speak for long periods, overwhelmed by the recognition that his skepticism had nearly caused them to abandon the search that had ultimately saved their daughter. When words finally came, they emerged as apologies whispered through tears that he had not allowed himself to shed during the entire ordeal, admissions of doubt and despair that he had hidden behind walls of practical resignation. Emily's gradual emergence from the protective shell she had constructed during captivity revealed glimpses of the daughter they remembered, while also showing the resilient young woman she had been forced to become. Her laughter, when it finally appeared, carried notes of caution that had never existed in her childhood expressions of joy, while her questions about their lives during her absence demonstrated a maturity born of circumstances that no teenager should have to navigate. She asked about their marriage, about Laura's work at the church, about Mark's firefighting career, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that information was a form of survival currency that could mean the difference between safety and danger. Detective Carter's ongoing briefings provided a framework for understanding Emily's experience that helped her parents begin processing the magnitude of what she had endured, while also preparing them for the long journey of healing that lay ahead. Quinn's operation had been designed to break down existing identities and replace them with absolute dependence on his authority, using techniques borrowed from cult indoctrination and military interrogation to create psychological compliance. The children in his program were systematically isolated from their previous lives through a combination of physical relocation, communication restrictions, and psychological manipulation that convinced them their families had abandoned them, or that returning home was impossible. The butterfly pendant's role in Emily's captivity emerged as a particularly cruel example of Quinn's psychological tactics. Rather than simply confiscating meaningful possessions, he had forced his victims to witness their treasured items being incorporated into his personal display of power and control. Emily had been required to watch him wear her butterfly pendant during daily indoctrination sessions, each glimpse of the silver wings serving as a reminder that her previous identity had been sacrificed to his vision of her new life. The pendants returned to Emily's possession, now carefully cleaned and blessed by the hospital chaplain at Laura's request, represented more than the recovery of a lost item. It symbolized the reclamation of an identity that Quinn had tried to erase. Laura's faith, which had sustained her through 2 years of searching despite Mark's gentle skepticism, found validation in Emily's rescue that transcended simple vindication of her intuitive beliefs. Her conviction that God would guide them to their daughter had been tested by countless false leads and crushing disappointments, yet her persistence in following what others dismissed as wishful thinking had ultimately led them to San Diego and the Google Maps image that started their final pursuit. The recognition that her maternal instincts and spiritual guidance had been accurate all along created a complex emotional landscape where relief mixed with gratitude and sorrow for the time they had lost to doubt and hesitation. Mark's transformation from skeptic to believer occurred not through sudden religious conversion, but through the humbling recognition that reality contained mysteries his pragmatic worldview had been unable to accommodate. His firefighter's training had taught him to rely on evidence, procedure, and logical analysis to solve problems and save lives, yet their daughter's rescue had been accomplished through Laura's intuitive leap that defied rational explanation. The Google Maps image that had triggered their journey could have been dismissed as digital artifacts or wishful thinking by any reasonable observer. Yet Laura's interpretation had proven absolutely correct. This revelation forced Mark to reconsider not just his approach to their family crisis, but his entire understanding of how knowledge and truth could be discovered. The hospital's social work team began preparing the Peterson family for the complex process of reintegration that would define their lives for months or possibly years to come. Emily's psychological trauma would require specialized therapy to address the indoctrination techniques Quinn had used, while Laura and Mark would need counseling to process their own guilt, grief, and recovery from the prolonged stress of their search. The family dynamics that had been fractured by Emily's disappearance and the different ways her parents had coped with loss would need to be rebuilt on new foundations that acknowledged how all three of them had been changed by their experiences. Detective Carter's final briefing before the Peterson family's departure from San Diego provided closure to their immediate ordeal, while opening new understanding of the criminal enterprise they had helped expose. Quinn's arrest had triggered a multi-state investigation that was revealing connections to trafficking networks operating across the western United States, with Emily's rescue serving as the catalyst for law enforcement actions that would ultimately save dozens of other children. The New Covenant Community Fellowship and its associated facilities were being systematically dismantled, while Iris Blackwood and other accomplices faced federal charges that would ensure Quinn's operation could never be reconstituted. Emily's first night of freedom was spent in a hotel suite near the hospital, where the Peterson family began the delicate process of learning to exist together in the same physical space after 2 years of forced separation. Laura found herself unable to sleep, instead sitting in a chair beside Emily's bed and watching her daughter's peaceful expression with the wonder of someone witnessing a miracle they had never quite dared to believe possible. Emily's sleep was restless but natural, unmarked by the signs of pharmaceutical sedation or psychological dissociation that had characterized her behavior during the early hours after rescue. Mark spent those wakeful hours walking the hotel's corridors and processing the complete inversion of his worldview that Emily's rescue represented. His identity as the practical parent who provided stability, while Laura pursued emotional possibilities, had been completely shattered by the recognition that her seemingly irrational hope had been their family's salvation. The Google Maps image that he had dismissed as wishful thinking had been their daughter's distress signal transmitted across time and space through digital coincidence that bordered on the miraculous. This realization forced him to acknowledge that reality contained dimensions of meaning and connection that his rational approach to problem-solving could not explain or predict. The butterfly pendant, now returned to Emily's possession and worn openly rather than as a symbol of captivity, caught the hotel room's lamplight as she slept and created tiny reflections that danced across the ceiling like promises of transformation and renewal. Laura found herself remembering Joseph Crowfeather's words about the butterfly representing the soul's journey from one state of being to another. Recognizing that all three members of their family had undergone metamorphoses during Emily's absence that would define the rest of their lives. They were no longer the same people who had lived in Cedar Ridge before that terrible Wednesday morning when their daughter had vanished. But they were finally together again and could begin the process of discovering who they were meant to become. Their journey home to Texas would begin the next morning. But the hotel room held them in a suspended moment where past trauma and future hope existed simultaneously without contradiction. Laura's faith had been vindicated not through divine intervention that defied natural law, but through the recognition that love could create connections that transcended rational explanation. Mark's skepticism had been transformed not into religious belief, but into humility about the limits of purely logical approaches to understanding human experience. Emily's survival had been achieved not through rescue fantasy, but through her own resilience combined with her parents' refusal to abandon hope even when hope seemed impossible to justify. The story that had begun with a mother's desperate late-night search through Google Maps images had ended with a family's reunion in a San Diego hospital. But the deeper narrative of faith, doubt, love, and transformation would continue evolving for years to come as they learned to live with the knowledge that miracles and tragedies could exist in the same world, sometimes separated by nothing more than a parent's willingness to follow intuition beyond the boundaries of rational possibility. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.